Now it's the time for Mr. Johannes Blankenbach, who is a US Western Europe senior researcher and representative. Please, it's your time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear President. Thank you very much for the invitation and for hearing me today. As you said, my name is Johannes Blankenbach, and I'm the EU Western Europe research and representative at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center is an international NGO working with all stakeholders to advance human rights in business. Our headquarters is in London, United Kingdom, but we have legal entities in a number of other countries, including in Germany, where I am located, as well as a network of regional researchers in all world regions. We track the human rights impacts of more than 10,000 companies in more than 180 countries, and we make information available through our 10-language website. We produce our own briefings and human rights benchmarks of companies, and we document also the policy and regulatory developments in this field of business and human rights. And yeah, thanks again for having me today. I think the processing of a bill on the creation of the Catalan Center for Business and Human Rights is good news, is excellent news for the growing business and human rights movement in Europe and worldwide. And it's also good news, especially for rights holders negatively affected by Catalan companies or by companies investing or active in Catalonia. It's also an opportunity, I believe, for companies from the region to become more resilient and more fit for the future. And yeah, you may be surprised, but in our work, we experience that quite a few companies are actually in favor of legislation that mandates respect for human rights. When my organization was founded about 20 years ago, so 2002, I think, the idea and practice of business and human rights was still very new, still very nascent. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, facilitated by John Ruggie and adopted in 2011, were then a first milestone, I would say, while these principles did not create new international law. They clarified the different roles and responsibilities that states and companies have to address business impacts on human rights. You will all be very aware of the three pillars that the UN Guiding Principles are based on: the state's duty to protect human rights, the company's responsibility to respect human rights, and then third pillar is access to remedy for victims of human rights abuse. And as Maha also alluded to, this third pillar, remedy, has received less attention than the other two pillars, and a lot of people affected by corporate human rights abuse across the globe do not have access to remedy, neither judicial nor non-judicial. So I would therefore encourage you as parliamentarians to design the Catalan Center's complaint mechanism, which I was happy to read is there. So I would encourage you to design that complaint mechanism in a way that can also promote affected people's access to remedy and compensation for harms they suffered from corporate activity. So at least I think the question whether or not a company has provided effective remedy for harms it was involved in, that should be part of the assessment and evaluation of companies that is done by the center. Or ideally, the center would have the authority to directly require companies to provide remedy. The UN Guiding Principles, as you may all know, also introduced human rights due diligence as the key instrument through which companies can implement their responsibility to respect human rights in their own operations and in their global value chains. And I think it's important to note that human rights due diligence is not an end in itself. It's not a process to tick off, but it's a means. It's not an end in itself, but it's a means to an end, and the end is avoiding human rights harm. And I think for any institution that wants to evaluate companies' human rights practices, like the Catalan Center, it is very important to really focus on the quality of the measures that companies take, rather than looking only at formal corporate policies, at contractual clauses they would use, or at social audit certificates that companies may present, for instance. In our experience, social auditing can be very unreliable. There's a lot of cheating, conflict of interest, whereas responsible purchasing practices, for instance, where the global brands use realistic delivery times and have long-term supplier relationships and fair purchasing prices, those can be a very effective measures to improve conditions further down in the supply chain, better than doing a lot of audits that in the end do not reflect much of the reality. We also recommend that companies have to talk to rights holders on the ground and seriously engage with unions, with human rights defenders, with affected communities, rather than just commissioning auditors. And that stakeholder engagement, I think, is very important. And yeah, the center ideally should promote that. The UN Guiding Principles recommend that governments should consider a smart mix of measures, as you know, mandatory and voluntary, to foster business respect for human rights. And so far, this smart mix of measures to promote business respect has leaned heavily towards voluntary measures, such as guidance for companies, dialogue events, multi-stakeholder initiatives, etc. These measures can be important, but as you all know, company progress in implementing the corporate responsibility to respect human rights has been very slow. Human rights and environmental abuse is still a grim reality in the operations and value chains of companies, including European companies, including companies from Catalonia. And in some sectors, abuses have even increased in recent years during the pandemic, for instance, when factory workers were abandoned by international brands, canceling their orders, etc. We also track a lot of abuse, a lot of human rights abuse related to the green transition, so the transition towards zero carbon. And we have a transition minerals tracker that documents what kind of abuses, human rights abuses, are related to the mining of minerals important for the green transition, for instance. So what we would say is there needs to be a fast and a fair transition towards zero carbon. Otherwise, it's unsustainable if it doesn't respect human rights at the same time. My organization also reaches out to companies in specific cases when the company has not yet responded to an allegation of human rights abuse. And between 2020 and 2021, we approached European companies over 600 times in response to allegations of human rights or environmental abuse. And 500 of those cases occurred outside of Europe. And many more are unreported, of course. We depend on the news and reports we get from other NGOs. So many cases of human rights abuse are unreported. We also conduct or produce benchmarks, human rights benchmarks of companies, and those benchmarks also show very slow progress. Typically, there are a few leading companies, but the majority of companies lags behind. So, for instance, according to our latest Know the Chain benchmark, which assesses forced labor risks, nearly half of the global companies we benchmarked failed to disclose undertaking human rights risk assessment in their supply chain. So almost half of the companies we evaluated do not assess risks, human rights risks in their global supply chains on forced labor in this case. So against all this background, which may sound depressing, the current trend in Europe and globally to move towards binding legislation, binding laws to make corporate respect for human rights mandatory is an overdue and extremely important and welcome development. I think the Catalan Center can be considered one important building block and innovative step towards more mandatory instruments in this field. It is also very welcome that the Parliament supports the passing of a legally binding international instrument. And yeah, I had a look at the draft, the draft bill. I think it is very good, for instance, promising that the Catalan Center can sanction companies which do not respond or inappropriately respond to investigation. It's an important feature that that measures also have teeth to create a true level playing field of good and effective practice. And again, there are also companies who support this idea that any legislation that is effective also needs these teeth and enforcement measures. Otherwise, it's not a proper level playing field, and maybe one company will take it seriously, but other companies will not take it seriously. So it's an important idea to have these sanctions and enforcement mechanism. It's also very welcome that the Catalan Center's one of the Catalan Center's purposes is regulatory innovation. As I mentioned, this is what is really needed in the business and human rights field. And as Maha also mentioned, there is currently at the EU level the debate on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which will still take a while, and which is indeed at the risk of being, or which is already being watered down. So I think this an initiative like the Catalan Center is very welcome in promoting, fostering the debate, and maybe the Catalan Center can be one of the voices pushing for a strong EU law and for strong implementation of this EU law at the state and sub-state level, because every law is only as good as its implementation. And yeah, what we currently see in the EU negotiations is that even though the EU law is meant to build on and align with the UN guiding principles and OECD guidelines, there are these constant attempts to further water down the legislative drafts. So for instance, the EU Council of Member States has adopted a position where they basically exclude the financial sector or financial services from the law's scope, which is I think extremely unfortunate. It's only the Council's position. So right now it's the Parliament formulating its position, the EU Parliament, and then there will be trilogue negotiations. And yeah, I think, for instance, inclusion of financial sector is extremely important, and maybe the Catalan Center could be one of the voices pushing for this. There are other asks from CSOs in these debates around mandatory due diligence, mandatory measures. One is indeed the personal scope of those initiatives. As you know, the UN guiding principles say that every company has a responsibility to respect human rights, including SMEs. And of course, the complexity of measures that can be different according to the size of the company, according to the severity of its impacts. But every company has this responsibility, and I think Catalonia has many SMEs. So inclusion of SMEs, I think, in your in the evaluation and control measures of the center could be extremely helpful. What is also, I think, important to note is that a company's responsibility does not end with its operations, subsidiaries, and branches abroad, but it also extends to the company's supply and value chain, as you may well be aware of. So companies also have a responsibility to prevent, to end, and remedy abuse happening at the level of the supply and value chain, and including in the so-called downstream value chain, that is the harmful impacts that may occur through the use of the company's products or services by others. Yeah, the UNGPs again provide a lot of guidance on what is expected from companies in this regard and how this can be implemented. And I think it's very important also for the center to have this full supply or full value chain perspective. So it's not just the operations abroad, it's also how the company contributes to abuse in the supply chain, for instance. I mentioned in the beginning this example of very exploitative prices that the company pays to suppliers. I mean, that can be a strong contribution to human rights issues in the deeper levels of the supply chain. Stakeholder engagement, I mentioned, is an important aspect. And of course, access to remedy. At the EU level, the mechanism that is being discussed is civil liability. So the opportunity for victims of abuse to go to court and and seek justice in front of EU courts, which I think is extremely important, both as an avenue for remedy, but also as an incentive for companies to actually conduct effective due diligence and truly respect human rights in business. And conflict sensitivity is, of course, another important aspect that should be part of companies' practices in the human rights field. So yeah, to conclude, I mean, I don't know to what extent these ideas can be implemented by the center. I think, yeah, the center should have all this on its radar, and it's a great innovation and a glimpse of hope. It's also an enormous asset for the Catalonia region, in my view, to have such a center, and we need more centers that can do research, provide guidance, monitor companies, and promote legislative innovation to really set the incentives and clear signals to shift business away from the old model of externalizing social and environmental costs towards a better, more sustainable business model that delivers shared prosperity and climate security. And yeah, with this, I would like to conclude and thank you. Thank you again, and I'm open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blankenbach.